Now that you know, I hope, that this course is going to be interesting, please forgive me for being boring just for a minute or two. The new College Board curriculum comes with a dizzying array of items called big questions, learning objectives, elements of essential knowledge, and enduring understandings. We're going to try to hit almost all of these, although I will usually try to avoid the jargon and skip the tiresome labels. But for now, I want to look at 2 of the learning objectives and the 4 big concepts that you must understand: form, function, content, and context. You'll notice, by the way, I have not dealt with them in the order they're presented here. I've already talked a little bit about function. It's basically the purpose that a work is intended to serve. So Donatello's sculpture of Judith, for example, served the function of connecting the Medicis to the Florentine fight to remain an independent republic. It also, of course, served to decorate and make the Medici courtyard more impressive to visitors. Content is what the work is about. The reason I started off with different artist renderings of the Judith and Holofernes narrative, aside from the fact that it's kind of fun and bloodthirsty, is that these more or less share the same content, which makes other comparisons easier. I talked about context in my last lecture. Actually, learning objective 3 is, quote, students describe how context influences artistic decisions about creating a work of art. I thought that was pretty much covered by objective 4, so I didn't stick it in. By the way, learning objective 2, there are 10 of them altogether, is students explain how artistic decisions about art making shape a work of art. That seems very general, and I think it's also subsumed in 1 and 4. At any rate, form is where we're heading now. So let's start with these 2 paintings, our early Artemisia Gentileschi and a much more modern painting, and I've already confessed that I can no longer locate the artist or title or date of this work. The content of the 2 paintings is the same. The function and context almost certainly are not. I'd be very surprised if the painting on the right was intended to call the faithful to battle for the Catholic Church. Modern-day feminism, likewise, gives the Judith story a rather different context, although I would argue that Artemisia Gentileschi was quite possibly striking a blow for women as well as the Church. That's a matter of historical dispute and, of course, interpretation. But what about the formal elements of the painting? Now, you were introduced to some of these in last night's reading, specifically line, shape, contrast, and emphasis or focal point. So let's use these new tools. What similarities do you see in line? And what purpose does line serve in these works? Well, as your textbook noted, the artist employs strong diagonals, which draws our eye to the bloody head. And what do diagonal lines in general tend to convey? Action, drama, movement. These are all staples of Baroque art. Remember, I've talked about how it was influenced by Italian Baroque opera. So what about shapes? Do the artists employ geometric or organic shapes? And is there any difference in their choices? Well, what really strikes me most obviously is the geometric squares that make up the background of the painting on the right and seem to contrast with the curved shapes of the women's arms and legs, although I'd still say they're geometric and stylized rather than really organic and natural. Notice, too, that this use of squares blunts some of the contrast of light and dark in Gentileschi's painting. Remember the term for that contrast of light and dark and the dark background? It's tenebrism. So what purpose was the artist on the right trying to achieve with this decision, with this break, if you will, from the painting that he or she appears to be imitating? I don't know. I'll be curious to hear what you have to say. In your reading, you looked at focal points, specifically with regard to Gentileschi's later version of the narrative, shown here on the right. The contrasting values of light and dark and the strong diagonal lines, again, lead our eye toward the dramatic murder. So is the head the focal point of the painting? Is that where your eye is naturally drawn? Maybe. I, though, find my eyes drawn even more to the place where the women's forearms intersect. To me, that places the emphasis a little more with the women than with Holofernes. What about the Caravaggio version? What's its focal point? Again, I may be reading too much into the painting, but to me, a difference between the two artists' interpretations is that Caravaggio focuses our eye at least as much on the dying Holofernes as on Judith, although it's true that Judith is really caught in the spotlight. But now let me ask a slightly different question. Where do we, the audience, the viewer, find ourselves with respect to these paintings? Where do we stand? Well, we're really looking straight into these scenes. Maybe in the case of the Gentileschi painting, we're looking just a little up, as we would if it were hanging on a church wall. Notice, though, that we aren't just looking into the painting. We're really invited to enter it. The paintings are intimate. And how does the artist create, how do the artists create this sense of immediacy, of intimacy? Well, as we've talked about before, the spotlighting draws us in, much as it does in the theater. The darkening around us takes us out of the audience. The spotlight puts us into the story. But there's another way in which these artists draw us into the painting, and again, very typical of Baroque art. Notice that the paintings are, to use a much more modern photographic term, cropped. The action spills out of the frame. It's cut off, if you will. We are zooming in, again, to use photographic terms. But if we zoomed in to see Judith beheading Holofernes, here we are zooming out to witness the epic battle between the Israelites and Assyrians, and more, as I'll get to in a minute. So here we're admiring the spectacle from afar, and maybe even a little from above, what we call the birdseye view. So what do we lose and what do we gain from this vantage point? Well, obviously, we lose some of the sense of drama and intimacy of being part of the story. But in exchange, we get a big picture, the whole dramatic scene. If this were a movie, some of this at least would be the battle scene with lots of extras. Think Lord of the Rings. But there's something else intriguing about this version of the narrative. How does this artist get around the problem of choosing which part of the story to tell when he's telling the story in a single work? He uses a technique called continuous narrative. I've circled 3 different scenes: the murder, Judith and her maidservant leaving Holofernes' tent, and the battle. This is a common narrative technique that we will see less often in more modern paintings. So what about focal point? It's not clear to me that there is a single focal point in this painting, but note how the line of the river bisects the two armies, and how the line of the path separates Judith's adventures in the Assyrian camp from the rest of the story. These lines help give the painting balance and rhythm, and they organize our viewing. This is a very complicated and busy painting. It helps us know where to focus our attention and draw our eye. This is a woodcut, a kind of print, and it gives us a different look at the power of line. So how is line used in this work? Well, note that woodcuts are an early print technique, as I just said, and basically the artist carves out the negative spaces and leaves the lines. Ink is then applied to the areas in relief. So notice how the artist uses line to convey really almost all of the information in this work. There's a little color added. So we see line used to convey texture, shape, expression. For example, the artist varies the thickness and density of the lines. Holofernes' mouth, for example, becomes a gaping black hole, big piece of wood used there and inked thoroughly. You should also see a contrast between the highly geometric straight line of the curve and of the sword, and the more curving, maybe more organic line of Judith's body. The woodcut also uses line to define volume. You see how the lines on her tunic widen out at the bottom. You see the cross-hatching or the crossed lines indicating shading. Think of paintings or drawings of light hitting a ball, a classic example of the problem of showing a 3-dimensional object on a 2-dimensional space. Notice, too, how the artist uses overlapping, so the sleeves overlapping the tunic give an impression of volume and space. And now for something entirely different. This is a cast bronze version of a wooden stage set created for a Martha Graham ballet of Judith and Holofernes, first performed in the middle of the 20th century. In other words, this work has a very different function than the others we've seen. Here, the line serves to frame a stage production. But notice, artistically, that the artist uses line to draw our eyes up toward the spearhead, out toward the fierce open jaw. It's a very spare way of communicating a lot of information about Holofernes. Here, by the way, is a photograph from the original production of the ballet, so you can see the scale of this in its original production and how it was used. Now on the right, we see the portion of Noguchi's stage set, and by the way, we see it in original wood, that represented Judith. So what do you notice about lines and shapes in this work? Well, Holofernes' lines are geometric, stark, straight, forgive me, perhaps phallic. Judith's are more organic, curved, more feminine. Again, I think there's a pretty clear sexual reference here. Let me just say that I think this would be a terrific work to use on an AP essay if you got the right kind of question. The graders, frankly, are going to be tired of reading essays about the work that the College Board has suggested. The works, I should say. This sculpture also has an especially interesting initial function and a function that changes when it's cast in bronze and placed as part of the sculpture garden at the Getty. Sends a very different message than when it's a stage set. So there's a lot more I could say about this fascinating work, and guess what? I do. This is the one page in your workbook that I have already entirely filled out. I did this partly to try to give you a better understanding of some of these complicated terms: function, context, iconography, meaning, etc. This is more than you're usually going to be able to find or write down about a piece. But again, I just wanted to give you a sense of what this kind of information could convey about a work. So here again, we see a more curving line and organic shape, again emphasizing Judith's femininity. This, by the way, is another expressionist Judith. I'm getting just a little ahead of my story, but notice how color is used expressively. You don't see a lot of women with green faces like that, but it does convey something. It creates emotion, and that's what Expressionism, is all about. We'll get there in the spring. Okay, we've already talked about this painting, but in case we didn't get to this in our discussion in class, what lines are missing here? There are no lines in the women's faces. Any thoughts about why the artist might have made that choice? Back to our old friend Artemisia Gentileschi. How does she solve what is in many ways the most fundamental problem of any drawing or painting? I talked about this a few minutes ago. How do you capture three-dimensional figures in a two-dimensional space? The term art historians or artists use, for that matter, is modeling. Notice how Gentileschi uses shadow brilliantly to create a sense of volume on a flat surface. Here again, too, the overlapping limbs create an illusion of three-dimensional space. Of course, there's an easier way to solve this problem using sculpture, which creates the volume directly. This head of Holofernes is an example of sculpture in the round, and the cameo of the beheading of Holofernes, by contrast, is a relief sculpture. In other words, one side is flat. We'll learn soon that some works are high relief, that is, that the relief sculpture stands out from its flat backing fairly far, is fairly high, and bas relief, which is low. Again, we'll talk more about that later. But for now, let's move on to color. I'm going to show you a series of paintings in quick succession, and I want you to think about how the artist uses color to convey meaning and to elicit a response from the viewer. Then we're going to examine the color wheel and return to look at these works at a little bit more leisurely pace. Okay, later in the course, you're going to read your textbook's excellent chapter on color, although, of course, you can always feel free to read ahead. We're also going to talk about how scientific studies of light and color helped transform painting in the late 19th century. For now, let's just have a quick introduction. I'm sure you've all seen the color wheel before. The inner triangle is the primary colors, and in the center we find the secondary colors formed by combining these primary colors. These are the colors of the rainbow. Combining secondary colors yields tertiary colors, which is the outer ring. Analogous colors lie next to each other on the color wheel, and this creates an effect that's often soothing. Putting them together, complementary colors lie across each other on the color wheel, and putting them against each other produces contrast and emphasis, a way of drawing our eye. And now the scary terms on the slide. Hue is just a fancy word for color. So the labels on the Crayola box are the colors hue. Value means lightness or darkness. Saturation is the trickier concept. Basically, it has to do with the brightness or dullness, or maybe a better term would be the purity of the colors. Do they seem muddied, or are they very clear? Descriptive or symbolic color is just what it sounds like, and we just saw that example of an expressionist work, which very much is using color descriptively and emotionally. Again, we're going to be talking about this a lot later. Consider this another trailer for the course. So now let's look briefly at the images I flashed a few minutes ago. Well, leaving aside the depiction of Holofernes' John Lennon, an interesting choice, how does this artist play with color? Well, red and green are contrasting colors designed to create excitement, to draw attention, to draw our eye. The saturation level is very high. These are pure colors without much gray or black mixed in. The values likewise are high. These are very bright colors. And of course, the colors are used at least somewhat symbolically. Presumably neither Holofernes nor John Lennon had scarlet hair. Is this perhaps evoking the blood? What about the green? I'm not sure, but is it perhaps the contrast of life with blood being spurted out at death? By the way, this is also a work in which the artist uses line. Notice the spouts in the hand and how they draw our attention to the head. Whose head does not appear in the painting? Judith. Why not? I'm curious to hear what you have to say. So how does Botticelli use color in this Renaissance painting? Again, we see complementary colors. The women's gowns are blue and orange, and this draws our eye to the two of them and to the contrast between them. Notice that the values are lower. These colors are not as bright. This is a much softer depiction. And yet, I would say the saturation is fairly high. The colors are reasonably pure. So notice that you can have low values, a low brightness, and high saturation, high purity. So what message does this pure but softly illuminated Judith send? How is it different from the message in the previous painting? To me, this Judith seems gentler, more feminine in the traditional sense. The sword in her hand seems almost out of place. Some of the Judiths we've seen seem awful comfortable wielding a weapon. Let's take up those technical terms again for this painting by Goya. The hue, mostly brown and black. I think the effect is depressing, and it was meant to be. Judith is not precisely being celebrated in this painting. The values, at least some of them, the blacks, are fairly high. I would say that's a fairly bright, strong black. Yet the saturation is low. Notice the dullness or lack of purity in the colors. And this has to do with the effect of the painting emotionally. The darkness, the dullness convey depression, which we know was Goya's mindset at the end of the brutal Napoleonic Wars. Okay, this is another one for which I can no longer find the gallery reference, and I'm sorry about that. But I found this artist's use of color very interesting and almost certainly highly symbolic or expressive. What is happening with color? Well, clearly a contrast is being set up. The blood leaps out all the more because the figures are black and white. They have been leached of color. Does that mean leached of life? As if color has escaped to the edges of the painting, where rather incongruously we see a rainbow. And what do rainbows traditionally symbolize? I mean, in Christian theology, at least, they're a symbol of hope. The rainbow comes out as part of God's promise that he'll never again send a flood. So what's the message? Has the act of killing drained life and color from Judith as well as Holofernes, while at the same time bringing hope to her people? There's one small, interesting piece of evidence from this interpretation. Does anyone see it? There's a tiny speck of color on Judith's chest. It's the French tricolor, the symbol of the French Revolution. So this, too, is a revolutionary Judith. Revolutions are famous for devouring, for destroying the people who make them. The phrase is actually the revolutions devour their children. This Judith does indeed seem to have been devoured, but hope persists. And notice also how the dagger just sort of sticks into the rainbow. Very interesting painting. Okay, I'm on to my last topic, and I'm going to go fast. One of the other important artistic choices, maybe the first artistic choice that an artist has to make, is what medium to use. What kind of materials? Will it be a sculpture? Will it be a painting? Will it be a photograph, a video, a work of performance art? So, in this case, the artist has chosen to depict the story with wire sculpture, and frankly, I don't know why, but it'd be interesting to speculate. We saw Judith and Holofernes as a Barbie and Ken sculpture. And here, this is a real favorite, is a diorama that uses a real praying mantis, presumably a dead praying mantis, dressed up as Judith. Any guesses why the artist chose this particular insect? Biology for 30? Or entomology at least? Well, praying mantises are famous, that is, praying mantis females are famous for devouring their mates after sex. Freud would have had a field day with this, so would Gustav Klimt. I don't think this one's that hard to figure out. We talked about this staged photograph by Cindy Sherman, again, one of your required works. But you see that she has used the medium of photography, but she's tied it into the medium of painting. And we're going to be looking a lot at sort of cross-media works in this, particularly when we get to global contemporary art. And speaking of which, here we see a computer-aided graphic of Judith and Holofernes taken to a whole new gory level. Okay, I'm going to close with another trailer for your next reading assignment. The AP curriculum guide actually opens with this, quote, unquote, big idea. In essence, it's a definition of art. It's a very broad definition, but let's note that what it presents as the elements of a work of art. Well, first of all, there's an artist or artists. Someone is making and executing creative decisions. There are materials. Some kind of physical manifestation is involved. The intriguing and kind of puzzling word is aesthetic. Aesthetic is defined by my old friend, the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, as of relating to or dealing with the beautiful. The Oxford English Dictionary defines it as concerned with beauty or the appreciation of beauty. I have to wonder if the College Board really thought through its wording. Would you describe the computer-generated Judith you just saw as beautiful? Evocative? Certainly. Dramatic? Yes. Thought-provoking? Yes. Beautiful? Well, obviously this gets us into the whole incredibly complicated notion of what is beautiful. I think aesthetic basically needs to be viewed more broadly than beauty, and I think that's what the College Board is saying as well. Note that art doesn't have to be an object. It can be an act or an event. We're going to see more of this again when we get to global contemporary art. Also, many art objects are part of events, particularly rituals or ceremonies, and this is going to be especially important when we look at early Christian art and also many forms of non-Western art. You're going to read about the object on the left, which is a rather famous sculpture by Brancusi entitled Bird in Space. It's actually one of the images that Ms. Jacobs and I have added to the required list. As you will soon read, it also featured in a famous court case involving the question of what really is art. It's going to win. Sorry to spoil the suspense, but I bet you guessed that. But how about the object on the right? Suppose this feather is lying on the forest floor, untouched, undiscovered. Is it art? It's clearly beautiful, but there's no artist, there's no manipulation. On the other hand, suppose an artist picks it up, names it Flight, and tries to get it exhibited in a museum, or even just sticks it on his table. Does it then become art? Before you jump in and answer, let me note that this is one of the College Board's required works. Yes, it is a urinal. The artist did manipulate it. He turned it on his side. He labeled the name of the plumbing company that he presumably got or supposedly got from. There's actually some controversy, as we'll see, about the origin of the work. He named it Fountain, and it became a really, really famous piece of 20th century art. So now you should be persuaded. It's going to be an interesting year.